Mrs. Puff, if that's even a real name, moves cities to escape her dark past. However, a victim from her past followed her and vows to get revenge under any circumstances. All of that is true, except the last part. Let's look at what's wrong with the Mrs. Puff theory. In the episode No Free Rides, Mrs. Puff goes to jail for stealing SpongeBob's boat. At the end of the episode, SpongeBob mentions how he talked to the warden, and all Mrs. Puff needs to do to leave is to give free driving lessons. Alex stated that this was one of Richard's tricks to force Mrs. Puff to spend more time with SpongeBob. But listen closely to what SpongeBob says.
And besides, the warden says she'll let you go early if you do her a favor.
SpongeBob clearly states that the warden is female. This means that Richard had no role in Mrs. Puff having to teach for free. But this begs the question, when did Richard become warden? In the episode No Free Rides, he clearly isn't the warden, so we have to find out when the next warden comes in. In the SpongeBob wiki, it said that the unnamed female warden eventually retired. This would mean that someone took her place. In the season 6 episode Shuffleboarding, Patrick and SpongeBob throw the warden of the prison into the prison for throwing away a Krabby Patty. This is a guy, meaning that the female warden has already retired, but this isn't Richard, so when does he come in? It obviously has to be after season 6, so sometime after that Richard was able to become the warden of the Bikini Bottom prison. But is the warden in Shuffleboarding really a warden? According to SpongeBob, it's the warden who they throw into the prison for throwing away a Krabby Patty. But looking at the SpongeBob wiki, we see otherwise. Looking at the history of the warden, he was initially a prison guard in the episode Doing Time. However, according to Alex, the episode is entirely in the mind of Mrs. Puff. The very next episode he appears in is directly Shuffleboarding, where he's the warden. So he probably became warden in season 6 and wasn't a prison guard beforehand. After that, he didn't have any interesting roles in the show, except maybe the prison guard when Richard became warden. That would mean that the warden from Shuffleboarding eventually went back to being a prison guard, and in his place Richard took over. You could question Richard's influence, but if he was in contention to become the warden, then he must have had a lot of influence over other people in the prison, including the ex-warden. This might be why Richard was able to jump on the opportunity to become warden when he did. In the episode Bumper to Bumper, Mrs. Puff mentions that if she doesn't continue teaching SpongeBob, then she'll have to face consequences. This happens as the camera pans to her ankle, showing she's on parole. Alex interprets this as the prison forcing Mrs. Puff to teach SpongeBob no matter what. But we've seen another organization forcing Mrs. Puff to teach SpongeBob and reminding her of the consequences if she fails to do so. In the episode Mrs. Puff You're Fired, a representative from the Boating Teachers Accreditation Bureau named Mr. Fitz tells Mrs. Puff that if she fails to pass SpongeBob, then she will be fired. She eventually does get fired, and while she does enjoy it, in reality she does need that job. Otherwise, she would have quit a long time ago. This is considering that she would rather kill SpongeBob than just quit. All in all, she isn't talking about Richard or the police when she says,
"He'd be out of my life once and for all. Unfortunately, I keep getting reminded of the consequences if I get too angry with the little nuisance."
But instead the Boating Teachers Accreditation Bureau. Throughout his theory, Alex tries to prove that Mrs. Puff is mentally unstable, and he does this by proving episodes like Doing Time and SpongeBob Long Pants were entirely imagined by Mrs. Puff. So who's to say that Mrs. Puff didn't have another episode and imagined the events of an entirely new episode? Summer Job starts with Mrs. Puff running away from SpongeBob until she eventually crashes into the Krusty Krab. Mr. Krabs decides to use Mrs. Puff to do work for free so he doesn't have to pay Squidward. Eventually, Mrs. Puff gets fed up with SpongeBob and storms out of the Krusty Krab. She then finds SpongeBob's note, tears it, and throws it on the ground. A nearby cop sees her and takes her to jail, where she eventually meets SpongeBob, who was hired as a teacher for the summer. Now let's break down why this episode happened inside Mrs. Puff's head. Firstly, SpongeBob appears in nearly impossible places all the time, but we can disregard this because this is common in other episodes, so it doesn't hold that much merit. The second and biggest giveaway to the episode being a dream is when Mrs. Puff leaves the Krusty Krab and it's once again fixed. Not only is it impossible for the Krusty Krab to be fixed so fast, but we don't see any repairs happening during the episode. Getting more philosophically, the entire episode follows the structure of Mrs. Puff's life. She deals with SpongeBob at the start and gets a moment of peace when she would eventually go home, only to go back the next day and deal with SpongeBob again. One more point is that when Mrs. Puff gets arrested, she nearly gets 2,500 days for littering. That would be impossible even if they found her for destroying the Krusty Krab. Also, one final point about the episode Summer Job is that Mrs. Puff was given orders for driving classes by the judge, not the warden.
The judge says you have to go to traffic school.
But this information is irrelevant because the entire episode happened inside her head. Also, Alex himself questioned if the episode was another one of Mrs. Puff's delusions. In the episode The Getaway, Dorsal Dan is arrested by a prison guard at the end of the episode while waiting for Sticky Fins. Alex comes to the conclusion that the warden of the prison, Richard, had Dorsal Dan arrested to make sure that Mrs. Puff stays lonely forever. But how did Richard know that Dorsal Dan and Mrs. Puff were even interested in each other? Unlike his other claim of Richard going after Mr. Krabs, this claim makes no sense. Let's make sense of it. So firstly, in The Getaway, the police start chasing SpongeBob and Sticky Fins after they were driving too fast and alerted the police. As the police were chasing them, they bumped into Mrs. Puff and Dorsal Dan, who were looking for them. Eventually there comes a cliff which Dorsal Dan and Mrs. Puff avoid, but SpongeBob and Sticky Fins fall down with all the police cars chasing them. Sticky Fins and SpongeBob land in the prison where Sticky Fins turns himself in. Dorsal Dan waiting outside gets caught by the same prison guard who used to be the old warden. Let's break down this entire episode. At the start of the episode, Dorsal Dan and Mrs. Puff are passed by the police while they're chasing Sticky Fins and SpongeBob. At that point, the two had just met each other. For the sake of the theory, let's say that Richard has total control over the police and whatever he says, they'll do. Even if the police reported back to Richard about the two, there was nothing suggesting that they were interested in each other. As the episode went on, the two got to know each other but never encountered the police. Basically, what I'm saying is that there was no way that Richard knew about their interest in each other. Also, when arresting Dorsal Dan, Richard clearly stated that he was a notorious getaway driver. This sounds like a nice excuse to take in your enemy's new love interest, except Dorsal Dan himself boasted about how he was a getaway driver to Mrs. Puff beforehand. So basically, Richard didn't arrest Dorsal Dan because he liked Mrs. Puff, but instead he arrested him because of his crimes. In this specific case, Richard wasn't trying to make Mrs. Puff lonely. But the Mr. Krabs case in the episode Krabs vs. Plankton says otherwise. Almost everything stated by Alex adds up and makes sense, except one teeny tiny thing. So according to Alex, Richard is from New Kelp City and moved to Bikini Bottom after the tragic accident that happened to his loved one. He comes to this conclusion after seeing Richard in New Kelp City in the episode Whatever Happened to SpongeBob, which is a season 5 episode. Even if Richard became the warden of the prison after season 7, what was he doing in Bikini Bottom in the season 4 episode Krabs vs. Plankton? The only logical conclusion would be that Richard had been living in Bikini Bottom beforehand and only figured out about Mrs. Puff during season 4. This especially adds up because he appears in other episodes like Suction Cup Symphony or Super Evil Aquatic Villains Team Up as Go, showing he lives in Bikini Bottom. This would mean that Richard might have lived in New Kelp City before but moved to Bikini Bottom later on. After learning about Mrs. Puff from seeing her in town, he decides to get his revenge and tries to make Mr. Krabs lose the trial, which would cause more misery to Mrs. Puff. But then what is he doing in New Kelp City in the episode Whatever Happened to SpongeBob? Alex only came to the conclusion that Richard is from New Kelp City from that one episode, but it happens after season 4. While he only appears for a brief second, Richard is seen in New Kelp City when SpongeBob is giving its address as mayor. While he only appears for a brief second, we still don't know why he might be there, so we have to assume. All we know is that Richard moved to Bikini Bottom before season 4. This would mean that he specifically went back to New Kelp City for a specific reason. Could he be trying to get SpongeBob to come back so he can enact the next part of his plan to make Mrs. Puff's life hell? Alex says that Richard being both a lawyer and a warden is unlikely because those are two major careers for a person to have. However, Richard could have been a lawyer in the episode Krabs vs. Plankton and became a warden later on. Both would require learning law in school, which would make sense. Also, in the episode Super Evil Aquatic Villains Team Up as Go, we see Richard holding his lawyer briefcase while waiting for the bus, meaning that he was still a lawyer at this point. Most likely, he became a warden around season 7 and got hired as the warden of the Bikini Bottom prison. So Alex saying that Richard being a lawyer and a warden is abnormal doesn't add up. Basically, Richard wasn't pretending to be a lawyer, but we can't say much about his intentions on whether he fell on purpose or by accident. So to recap what I've fixed, Richard moved from New Kelp City to Bikini Bottom sometime before season 4. He eventually figured out that Mrs. Puff too lives in Bikini Bottom and decides to enact his revenge. When he approached Mr. Krabs, he wasn't pretending to be a lawyer, but instead was a real lawyer who would eventually become a prison warden. He wasn't the one who forced Mrs. Puff to get free driving lessons in the episode No Free Rides, nor was he the one forcing her to teach SpongeBob in the episode Bumper to Bumper. He also didn't force her to take a driving class in prison, nor did he hire SpongeBob in the episode Summer Job, because that entire episode was a dream that was imagined by Mrs. Puff. Once Richard eventually became the warden of the Bikini Bottom prison, sometime after season 7, he didn't arrest Dorsal Dan for his interest in Mrs. Puff, but instead because he was a getaway driver. This would mean that the only thing Richard has done against Mrs. Puff was when he tried to get Mr. Krabs arrested in the episode Krabs vs. Plankton. After learning that SpongeBob was able to save Mr. Krabs in court, he must have been sad about what happened and once again tried in his next appearance. He learns that SpongeBob became the mayor of New Kelp City and decides to go back home to get SpongeBob to come back to Bikini Bottom in the episode Whatever Happened to SpongeBob. But Sandy and the gang got to SpongeBob before he could. After this, he tries to get close to the gang in the episode Suction Cup Symphony, where he pretends to be a musician and plays in Squidward's symphony, but doesn't get his chance there either. After that, we see him in his daily life or as a prison warden in the episode The Getaway. Considering Richard stopped so quickly in trying to get his revenge, the reason for his hatred might not be the same loved one that died in New Kelp City, or maybe he isn't trying to get his revenge after all. So we mentioned how Richard really is a lawyer. He isn't pretending to be one to make Mr. Krabs go to jail. So far, the only time Richard has tried to do anything against Mrs. Puff was against Mr. Krabs in the episode Krabs vs. Plankton. So if we can prove that that specific incident had nothing to do with Mrs. Puff, then we can say that Richard hasn't done anything against Mrs. Puff at all, which removes the whole basis of the mastermind aspect of the Mrs. Puff theory. So looking at the evidence stated by Alex first mentions that Richard showed up out of nowhere to be Mr. Krabs' lawyer. He also mentioned that Richard will be Mr. Krabs' lawyer completely for free. To break it down, any lawyer would jump at the chance to take part in a big trial. Because Mr. Krabs is well known for his restaurant, it would help Richard go in his career to fight for Mr. Krabs. Then listen closely to what Richard says.
Actually, I won't charge a dime unless we win.
He's not providing his services for free, but instead only receives payment if they win, which various lawyers do to get more clients. In other words, what Richard did is completely normal for a lawyer to do, meaning so far he hasn't done anything which suggests that he's gonna make Mr. Krabs lose on purpose. Now the main part that suggests that Richard is trying to lose on purpose is that Richard put SpongeBob as a lawyer after getting injured. One point to remember is that he himself called SpongeBob a liability. But there's one thing we're forgetting. Only SpongeBob was in the restaurant. Mr. Krabs had left before the lawyer to get a free parking spot. Squidward would also appear later as a testimony, meaning he wasn't in the Krusty Krab either. If Krabs was leaving and Squidward wasn't there, he probably closed the restaurant for the day, considering he doesn't trust SpongeBob enough to run it by himself. Since no one was there in the Krusty Krab, SpongeBob was the only person Richard could pass the briefcase to because no one else had any idea of what happened to Richard. Now we move on to the combination and what was in the briefcase. Now we know that SpongeBob was late to the courthouse because the lawyer fell. In the heat of the moment and SpongeBob being late, he might not have been able to tell SpongeBob the combination. Now it all goes down to what was in the briefcase, which was a Krabby Patty. Was it truly his lunch, or was it genuinely the answer to win the case? Considering all the evidence so far points towards Richard not being against Mr. Krabs, I'm gonna go out and say that Richard had an idea and knew that SpongeBob would understand it. Even though it's not perfect evidence, we can somewhat safely say that Richard has not done anything against Mrs. Puff, meaning that he isn't the mastermind and has done nothing bad or wrong against Mrs. Puff. So since Richard hasn't done anything against Mrs. Puff, then how can we explain the photo of the guy in her house? Alex mentions that all the photos in Mrs. Puff's house are meaningful to her. We see photos of Mr. Krabs, Snelly the Snail, photos in her bedroom, and of course the infinitely looping photos seen in No Free Rides, Bumper to Bumper, and Potato Stuff. To prove that it's just another photo, we need to find one more random photo in Mrs. Puff's house that doesn't look to be meaningful to her. Now I looked through every frame of Mrs. Puff's house in every episode her house shows up in, and found just one photo. We see a photo of a random guy in the episode No Free Rides we've never seen before. He looks familiar, but we've never seen him. However, unlike the green guy, who could be related to Richard, who we only saw once, we see the same guy in the episode My Two Krabses. Because the show is now in HD, we can see it's a shark. But what does this shark have to do with Mrs. Puff? Looking at all the sharks in the show, it looks like none of them. He has a hat that looks like a military hat. It could prove that not all the photos in Mrs. Puff's house have meaning to her, but there could be more to it. Since she's had that photo from before season 3, it could be someone she's known from a long time ago. It couldn't be Mr. Puff because we know that he became a lamp in the episode Krusty Love. It couldn't be their child because how could two pufferfish have a shark? Unless someone cheats. Mrs. Puff has been known to cheat on Mr. Krabs when she starts flirting with Dorsal Dan while dating Mr. Krabs. If she can do that to Mr. Krabs, who's to say that she didn't do that to Mr. Puff? Looking at her past, she's never been an ethical person. Also, considering all the pictures in her household have meaning to her, why aren't there any pictures of Mr. Puff? Sure, she thinks he's dead, but why doesn't she have a picture of him, but instead multiple of Mr. Krabs? But we've only seen her cheat once. Sure, she isn't an ethical person, but we can't just assume because she flirted a bit with a criminal, right? Well, I'm about to show you something that shocked my mind when I saw it. In the season 14 episode Buff for Puff, Mrs. Puff falls in love with Larry the Lobster. It sounds normal until you realize that happened when she was on a date with Mr. Krabs. 14 seasons in, and the show writers are still trying to show us about Mrs. Puff's dark past. Mrs. Puff has never been an ethical person, and that shows with multiple attempts to cheat on her significant other. Flirting with Dorsal Dan in the episode The Getaway showed her intentions with Dorsal Dan while dating Mr. Krabs. Then in the episode Buff for Puff, she showed her true side when she fell in love with Larry while on a date with Mr. Krabs. That specific photo of the shark could be a son she had with someone else while married to Mr. Puff. This would explain why she has no photos of Mr. Puff anywhere in her house. Not knowing about this, Mrs. Puff could have lied about Mr. Puff's capture to explain to everyone why she moved to Bikini Bottom in the first place. Alex states in his theory that Mr. Puff might still be alive and Mrs. Puff's happiness is only a town away, but that happiness might have faded a long time ago. Mrs. Puff truly has a dark past that she's tried to escape from a long time ago. She decided to move to Bikini Bottom to start a new life, only to be stuck with SpongeBob. Instead of having a mastermind controlling her life and forcing her to be lonely, she caused her own pain through her actions. I would like to assume that Mr. Puff is probably still alive and lives in New Kelp City, where he loathes Mrs. Puff for what she did to him. Mrs. Puff has no one but herself to blame for where her life has gone and how she's destroyed it.